Looking at the ideologies represented in the documentaries that I watched during my summer, I definitely watched a variation of documentaries, some that were specific to ideologies and some that were quite objective, in representing stories that were either ideologically influenced or stories that were more objective and just talking about a story. Looking at some quite obvious ideologically influenced stories. There is the Seaspiracy, which looks at the effects of human behaviour and on the environment, and more specifically how bad the abuse of the environment is as a result of humans. A lot of the ideologies within the documentary Seaspiracy references to the slaughter of sea life and the impacts on the environment, as well as referencing human trafficking and slavery. One very obvious ideology in a documentary was from the documentary The Great Hack, which talked about the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So obviously the ideas of consumer consent and user consent within platforms such as Facebook was definitely brought up within this documentary. It basically detailed the events that happened prior and post of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and followed one of the women who set up Cambridge Analytica and helped incorporate Cambridge Analytica with the US presidential election in 2016. Obviously the ideologies within that were to do with user consent within such powerful platforms such as Facebook. Another quite common ideology found in documentaries is that of addiction and life on drugs or life on the street. One documentary that I watched called Heroin, with the E in the brackets towards the end, it basically shed a different light on life with addiction, and portrayed a heroin woman, who looked after and tried to save addicts. Obviously, with any documentary or anything referencing addiction or drugs, the ideology of addiction and the treatment of people lesser off in the world definitely comes up. This documentary definitely is a way of trying to shed a positive light on addiction and demonstrate or illustrate these people or these addicts as human beings, which often within addiction documentaries isn't appreciated. People demonstrate people or illustrate people with addiction as lower and on the street and scamming away. However, this documentary follows the long journey of addiction through from people responding to overdoses to people in court trying to get clean for their rehab. Another very interesting documentary, which isn't very typical, it's quite niche, was that called Period, End of a Sentence, which basically referenced the stigma faced by Indian women towards menstruation. The documentary obviously raised the ideology or referenced the ideology of women and the rights of women, especially within countries such as India. The documentary follows women who set up this pad business, trying to get pads and sell pads to all these women throughout India. It's a very short documentary, but it's very uplifting. And it definitely references a newer type of ideology within documentaries that isn't so typical of being of following crime or historical events. This documentary looks at ideologies that are current and less relevant to the people that were watching them on streaming websites. It's quite interesting to the fact that you're watching a documentary that you don't necessarily associate with, however you still are engaged with it. Ideologies are quite an apparent part of documentaries. A lot of documentaries being fueled by the ideologies that they're trying to represent.